itself. So, Mélina, I'd love to ask you, your organization is named aptly the Anti-Racist Educator. So would you mind explaining the difference maybe between, just not being racist and being anti-racist, and then perhaps outlining a few ways in which teachers can actively and actionably work towards this, both inside the classroom with their students and also outside the classroom in terms of the difficult discussions that need to be had with people who really hold the power, like head teachers or heads of heads of their subject. So how would they work towards doing that?
Yeah, sure. So I'd actually like to start off with the point you mentioned and Pamela mentioned about just racism being a white problem. So just a little reminder that for teachers of color in white institutions, it's not our job to do all the anti-racist work. So it's really important, as you said, to also focus on our survival, because when you do anti-racist work as a person of color, Black person, BME, you are going to face a lot of resistance, a lot of white fragility, retaliation that can have an impact on your life, your job prospects. So I think it's important to bear that in mind when I give you advice about what it means to be anti-racist. What's the difference between not being racist, anti-racist? I think we need to start off again from that decolonial perspective, thinking about how coloniality is embedded in every aspect of our lives and our culture. I'm going to use Salman Rushdie's quote. He says that 400 years of conquest, looting, for centuries of being told that you're superior, leave their stain. So this to white people, this stain has seeped into every part of our culture, the language we speak. So I speak English because my mother is Indian. That's a legacy of coloniality, and everything about our daily life, and nothing much has been done to wash it out. So we have to start from that point by accepting that following the status quo, be it in education, following the status quo in the terms of the curriculum is by default racist. So start off by that point and start asking yourself, right, how has racism seeped into my curriculum, into my everyday practices, into the way I view Black pupils, into the way that Black pupils are excluded more in schools, for instance. So starting off from that really helps us think a bit more critically about where we see racism and how we can actively become anti-racist. So that's where the Anti-Racist Educator came about, really is an online learning platform. I think one of the key things teachers, educators need to start developing, especially leaders in schools, as well as parents and politicians, we need to start off with our racial literacy. We need to develop our racial literacy. And what that means is really developing a critical awareness of what racism is and how it works. Because very often in education, racism is portrayed as just an example of bullying. Oh, it just happens and we'll just try and stop it. It's not just a question of racist incidents. We really need to unpack what we mean by racism. So breaking it down into interpersonal racism, internalized racism, so how young pupils of color internalize racism and start hating the color of their skin because of the curriculum that's so white. In Scotland, and I'm sure in England as well, there are many cases of pupils who actually try to whiten their skin because they feel like they don't belong, they don't feel valued by the things that they're taught at school. And in worst case scenarios, it can lead to, self-hate, self-harm. So we really need to think about why we're doing this. Why are we decolonizing the curriculum? We're thinking about making sure that our pupils of color are empowered, but also it's also for white pupils. I think that's where a lot of resistance comes when we're talking about anti-racism. People often think it's just for pupils of color. And in Scotland, we're only about 3% BME population compared to the general population, so it's majority white population. I keep reminding people that actually white pupils need to decolonize their minds as well, because it's as Mugwena was saying in his presentation that you, as a white person with a white curriculum, you're going to internalize superiority and you're going to have a very limited worldview, as Pamela was explaining really well. So we need to make sure that we are educating our white pupils as well, so that they can go into the world and succeed in a diverse workforce, and not perpetuate and not be surprised by the diversity and not perpetuate racial violence. And another feature of racism that is really important in your anti-racist practice would be systemic and institutional racism. So understanding how schools and education systems are collectively failing pupils of color, BME pupils. So decolonizing the curriculum really helps us combat both internalized racism and, by extension, interpersonal racism. So there'll be fewer racist incidents if white pupils and pupils of color decolonize their minds through the curriculum. But it's also about questioning those practices, those attainment practices that are causing exclusion and marginalization, so more systemic level. So develop our racial literacy, I would say also decolonize our minds, just for teachers of color, for educators of color, survival, acknowledging that taking care of yourself in a white institution is an act of resistance, and that it shouldn't be up to you to do all the work. We should be holding power to account. We should be holding our schools responsible. We're asking them what they're doing, and don't expect us to do all the work for free. So with the anti-racist educator, we've tried to make more of an accessible, mainstream critical understanding of racism. But again, we're a voluntary organization. We can't do all the work by ourselves for free. We are keen to collaborate, but again, it's about valuing the emotional labor that people of color put into this work. And that's something we are trying to do. So to help you decolonize your mind as well, I suppose I should probably explain what the Anti-Racist Educator does. As an online platform, we have a website where we share some of our stories, our counter-narratives, focused on a Scottish perspective. We have a glossary with anti-racist key terminology, breaking down what it means, what race is, or it means what racism is, and other key terms. And we also have a podcast where we're interviewing a bunch of scholars and experts in anti-racism to make that racial literacy more accessible. Because I think that's one of the major barriers, is actually being on the same page when we're trying to do this. And finally, I think I would end on, I would say it's really important to create safe spaces for those people of color in education. So for pupils, it could be an anti-racist club or an affinity group for pupils of color to get together and sort of process and verbalize their racialized experiences, because many schools don't have those spaces for them. And for teachers, that means also having a safe space where you can meet other people, other educators of color who have shared experiences. For me, that's been in my trade union. We had one of the biggest BME conferences for teachers, where I've started realizing actually that racism was so big, it was such a big problem in education. And in Scotland, the Scottish Association for Minority Ethnic Educators has been really helpful in helping me feel empowered and realizing that any so-called failures of mine are not necessarily internal problems with me. It's also because of the white institutions that I work in, and the education system, which doesn't always value the my perspective advantage as a person of color in education. So creating those safe spaces where we can empower other educators of color. And yeah, I'll just end on allyship. White people need to step up and really keep up the momentum. I don't want to see people who've been using the Black Lives Matter hashtag stopping in a couple of months. Racism is not going to be dismantled overnight.